This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
All right, welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight I'm going to be airing the second part of my conversation with Walter Bosley about his book, Destination Carcosa, which deals with Ambrose Bierce's potential involvement with the Empire of the Wheel that Walter has slowly uncovered, potentially. Again, there's a lot of speculation here, but it's a really interesting possibility of things. So that's this show tonight. Next week, I am going to have Erosion from Project Archivist live in studio. That's going to be a live show if you listen on WVBR at 10 p.m. Eastern. And you'll be able to throw us comments or questions if you want while we're talking on air. So that will be on May 26th. For anyone who is not sure when that is, just to kind of put that in a place and time. May 26, 2018. Live show for Where'd the Road Go with Erosion from Project Archivist. All right. That's all I have right now. Here's the second part of my conversation with Walter Bosley. All right, Walter, welcome back for this second part of this conversation on your Ambrose Bierce book. And I want to get into some of the weirder stuff I guess you could say it's weirder stuff that you talk about on here.
Mm-hmm.
For one, the crystal skull connection. I was always fascinated by the crystal skulls, and you actually have some history here where the Mitchell Hedges skull, is it Hodges or Hedges?
Hedges.
Hedges. Okay, skull may have come from.
Well, it's pretty much in recent years been shown, by other writers and researchers that the story that Anne Mitchell Hedges, Mitchell Hedges' daughter, would tell about the discovery of the skull was not true. That she would tell that it was her birthday and she was walking through this site of ruins and just tripped over, and there it was, and she was part of the discovery. Well, the facts are, when you look closely and dig into it, the facts are that where it came from was probably a discovery that had to do with intelligence agents, and the skull itself it's the way it was constructed. It can be traced to crystal makers in Germany in the mid to late 19th century. The style and the technology. They had the ability to do these amazing things with crystal, and the actual possibility is potentially as wild as the stories we're led to believe about the crystal skull, and that is that it might have been used to look for anomalies in the terrain or lost relics or something, along the lines of like an esoteric GPS device. But essentially, and I go into the details in my book and the sources of this, but essentially it's something that was most likely crafted in the mid 19th century in Germany. Well, the idea that, Hedges just stumbled upon this thing when actually there is what's the word for it? A line of record where it was most likely owned by a gallery owner who was involved very likely in British intelligence. So there's this whole murky thing about the skull that is unclear. It remains unclear. I had to do some identified as such, but some speculation on that. But there's actually this whole other history where Hedges purchased the skull or obtained the skull from this guy who owned the gallery, who was connected to British intelligence. And that the story about Anne finding it was just something that was made up for a radio show he did in the late 1940s. That's the first time we ever hear that story. And then it was included in a later edition of Mitchell Hedges' book about his life, Danger, My Ally. And what's interesting in that book is he was supposedly riding with Pancho Villa. That was the popular phrase. I was riding with Pancho Villa around the time that Bierce allegedly was riding with Pancho Villa. And as this gentleman who wrote the obscure pamphlet says in his book, it's very likely the reason that Hedges never mentioned Ambrose Bierce, it's because, perhaps it was a courtesy, or operationally required because they were both intelligence agents. But what's interesting is Hedges never mentioned ever encountering Ambrose Bierce during the time that he was supposedly riding with Pancho Villa. Bierce was supposedly riding with Pancho Villa. And Hedges actually was riding with Pancho Villa, as they say, and was probably a British intelligence agent at the time. So here you have the murky world of espionage and spies going on surrounding the milieu of the crystal skulls, which is not the popular version we'd been treated to for, the past several years until fairly recently. And yet the actual story that's emerging is even more interesting than the fake version we were told for years. So it's and the Ambrose Bierce connection would be, if according to this gentleman's book that I talk about in my Bierce book, he would have been involved on the American side of, the retrieval of this thing. The idea being that they knew that the Germans had brought it over to Mexico and they had an idea where it might be and that they got their hands back on it and they worked together theoretically to obtain this crystal skull and get it into the hands of British intelligence.
Now, didn't that skull get analyzed by HP or something in one of their labs, and they said that it couldn't be replicated with our technology?
It's there. Yeah, it's what it was kind of misleading, that whole thing, because that is usually told from the perspective that, this crystal skull was ancient. What they said actually resonates with the idea that it could have been made by these crystal makers in the mid-19th century. I think there was one guy who had, made a comment like that. What they found was the precision of its craftsmanship and the presence of a prism in the center of it. Okay. Right. And that this prism could have been used to pull off all sorts of lighting effects that would, scare the natives or, impress believers, that kind of thing, if, one knew how to manipulate the light or whatever going through it. But when you look, there's a gentleman, Nick Nocerino, who's talked about in the Childress Crystal Skulls book, that did a lot of this research before. I think he's passed away since. And he did a lot of this research on, and I think Nocerino, I could be wrong, I think he's the one that discovered this Bavarian or this German crystal makers connection, to the crystal skull mystery. That's the thing, though. It's more fun to hear the mystical Anne Mitchell Hedges story about the crystal skull. It's more fun to, see these things displayed and hear somebody, tell you all this new agey stuff. Oh, but it does this. Oh, it does that. And the new agey type wild stories, they're a lot of fun And they die hard. They die real
Well,
hard
sure.
because people want to believe, and they want to believe the more fantastic story and tale, and so this, that aspect keeps getting perpetuated. But again, it's one of those things which is what I did and what I talk about in the Bierce book. And, when you actually look more closely at the actual details that are there, you see this other, this other truth emerge from what we've been told.
Where would they have even come up with the idea of making a crystal skull, though?
Well, that gets into these guys were a lot of them were mystics. Okay. So the whole thing about, skulls and mysticism, when you go and you visit the ancient Mayan ruins in Mexico, I've had the good fortune of doing that twice with David Childress's group. He's a great guide. I highly recommend, going to these places with him. The skull was a major motif in some of these ancient temples. So when you, again, look at the details and you say, okay, if these German crystal makers created, one or more of these skulls for, these German archaeologists or whoever, brought them over to Mexico, to Mesoamerica, it's very possible that they used the skull motif because they were looking for other resources. And again, this is an extrapolation, this is a speculation based on, what we know. It would be a smart symbol to use if you're trying to get the upper hand with the local native cultures. Here you show up with this crystal skull, and we don't know what other device they used with this skull. We only know about the skulls. And here these guys are, these crafty, tricky European guys, and they've got these crystal skulls, and they can do these tricky things because of that prism in the middle of it. And who knows what kind of things they did to scare the natives or impress the native cultures, that we have the magic, we have the power of the ancient skull, and on and so forth, to get them to maybe tell them where the gold is hidden or the oil is. I hate to make it sound that mundane, but whatever the MacGuffin was, that thing that the guys who brought the crystal skulls over, whatever that thing was that they valued, that they were after, it was worth it to them to use trickery and this stuff, sleight of hand, and that right there is the possibility that others before me and I also, present to the reader.
Okay. All right. And it does seem like a lot of effort must have been gone into making the skull. I mean, regardless of who made it.
Yes and no. I mean, yeah, it's quite a feat of crystal work. It's quite a feat of craftsmanship. Yes. But it's something that when you read about this and you look closer, you find out that they could do. These guys could do it. And, it wasn't like they only did that one and that was their amazing peak of craftsmanship. This was something they could do. Oh, you want a crystal skull? Okay, give us X number of weeks or whatever. Boom, here's your skull. So it's, yeah. It's kind of like, the difference between simple and easy, right? I mean, the process might be simple. It doesn't mean doing the job is easy, right?
Right.
So I think it was something like that, and I apologize. I don't have some certain things at the tip of my tongue. It's been a while since I talked about this book. And I like to joke, one of my favorite moments in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is when, they've lost the book, and Indy's trying to get his dad, Sean Connery, to remember something about where the Grail is or whatever. And Connery, says, I wrote it down so I wouldn't have to remember it.
Yeah.
So I like to joke when I trip over, when I haven't talked about something for a while, and I'm apologizing that I can't remember a particular detail. I like to say, I wrote the book so I wouldn't have to remember. So.
Do you think that there's any chance any of the crystal skulls floating around are ancient, or do you think they've all been
Oh,
modern
who
fakes?
knows? I mean, some of them, there might be some. I would honestly say that of the civilizations that, we know we can point to in known ancient history, um, they would probably be the more crudely crafted ones. But I am an advocate of the very high civilization the farther you go back. So I think if you found a skull that was crafted like we could do in our modern world, when I say that, from the 19th century to our times, um, I would say you'd be more likely to find that the farther you go back, and it would be a product of this very high civilization, or the VHC, that has been lost, is kind of lost in the mist of time, you know. So yes, I think it's possible. I can't be an advocate of what I'm just, of a lost advanced technological civilization of the past and say that, no, there couldn't be any authentic ancient crystal skulls that are of that amazing craftsmanship. Of course, I think there very well could be.
Yeah, and and you point out in the book something that has been pointed out many times before, but the older structures out there are the more
Advanced.
the more
Yeah,
advanced ones.
yeah, and you can see that demonstrated when you go to, these places in South America or Mexico and stuff. I mean, it's there. You're looking right at it, and it's pretty amazing. It's fascinating to see this stuff. It really is. It's impressive. If it doesn't leave an impression on you when you see this stuff, you're just being a stick in the mud, in my opinion.
um, so let's talk a little bit about the idea of an ancient civilization, because that's something you bring up in the book,
Hmm.
that he may have been down, Bierce may have been down in Mexico,
Hmm.
looking into lost technology.
Yeah.
And it's not unknown to people, I think, that the Nazis were looking for anything they could find.
Well,
That seems to be more common knowledge.
right. Of course, in 1913, the Nazis didn't exist,
Right,
but
right.
their precursors, the elements, the facets of society, the groups that would eventually, the Nazis would emerge from, those they very definitely existed.
Hmm.
And excuse me, Bierce being who he was, I think the lost civilization and the technologies probably fell more in the category of his personal interest.
Hmm.
I think, as far as his collections work, that I think he was doing after he disappeared into Mexico, that was more along the lines of, okay, go just be kind of the old tourist, guy who's wanting to see the pyramids and such, and just kind of report on any Germans or German activity you see there. And that would have been World War One related, for that
Yeah.
effort. And yes, this was prior to the United States entry into that war. But hey, our intelligence guys are very often the first ones who get involved in wars. And I think that was the extent of his intelligence work. I think by the time he got into South America, then we get into my big fat speculations regarding his potential association with this American breakaway civilization. If he had an association to them, and I point out his personal connection to men who were known to have built, traditional airships, early Zeppelin type things, and those who were suspected to be involved in the 1890s airship mystery. He was in those milieus. If he was truly associated with this other breakaway civilization, he would have been, then, I think, in South America, working on their behalf to
Hmm.
see what the Germans were doing down there. Because, as people who have read Empire of the Wheel 2, Friends from Sonora, and my origin book know, I lay out what I think the German NIMSA German airship milieu was doing in South America, starting in the early 19th century, leading up to the time when Ambrose Bierce disappeared.
Um, so let's get into South America. You think he went to South America
Yes.
looking for some of these ancient cities?
Oh, I think even if all my speculations turn out to be hogwash, just don't turn out to be true, the man who Ambrose Bierce we know him to have been, I think just purely as a tourist and student of history and a man interested in the strange, misty past and these things, I think, part of his reason for wanting to go to South America was to see, the ancient ruins that everybody had heard talked about and some few people had seen. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable conclusion. Set aside all the stuff about the airship, the intelligence agencies, even the possible connection to Treasure Sierra Madre. Set aside all of that speculation. I still argue that Ambrose Bierce, the man, would have definitely have been interested in going to, the places like Machu Picchu and Pumapunku and, all that, Lake Titicaca and stuff.
Okay, and of course, is it Lake Titicaca that wraps into that raft mythology? And
it's that brings it back to that connection to the gentleman who died on the raft in San Bernardino in 1915. Yeah, it gets into the whole South America and the witchcraft, and the witchcraft, of course, then ties into the symbolism that the spiritualists were, I think, using in whatever it was they were doing in 1915 in San Bernardino.
Now, do you think that was directly the Friends from Sonora, this breakaway civilization that was involved in this occult working?
Here's why. No, they were not involved in the occult working. See, here, my theory is that the guy arrested on the train, his name was Frank Rosasco. He was 24 years old. It's my proposal, hypothesis, that he and the woman Cora Stanton, who she really was, which I talk about in the second Empire of the Wheel book, I think there was an association to this American airship group that was in opposition to NIMSA. And you see, under NIMSA, the spiritualists functioned and operated. Okay, the spiritualists in America, included the Theosophists and these other groups like that, and they had very close ties to the German mystics and the German occultists at the time. Okay, so I guess the allegiance of these suspect spiritualists that I talk about in Empire of the Wheel, their allegiance would have been to the German mysticism side. And the allegiance of this other breakaway group, the American group, which I believe Frank Rosasco likely had an association to, they were in opposition to that. They most definitely would not have been allied or involved with these spiritualists at all. And I think that what happened to stay with this connection. Okay, Frank Rosasco was of the Rosasco ranching family, very well-known family even to this day up in Tuolumne County, old California ranching family. Okay, an Italian family who their ancestors who first established a ranch there came in the 1850s. Okay, at the time that the Sonora Aero Club was allegedly building their flying machines. Now get this, according to Delshow, there were Italian immigrants involved in this Aero Club group. These Italian immigrants were specifically ranch owners in the 1850s who would allow the Aero Club to construct and house their flying machines in barns like hangars, in barns on their ranches. Now, here's the connection to this Frank Rosasco in the Empire of the Wheel mystery. Very much a real guy, very much arrested on that train in 1915. He was of that family. And he's arrested on a train going bonkers in the middle of what, if you just look at the three children alone, looks like a murder mystery, okay, going on in the San Bernardino Valley. And he's released the next day to unidentified friends from Sonora that come get him. That spells somebody's got some power and influence, okay, or somebody was able to prove that he had nothing to do with this stuff. Okay, Frank Rosasco, 24 years old, college graduate, by all accounts had a brilliant future ahead of him. He was an engineer. That's what his education was in. I talked to the family. I talked to his great nephew, and Frank Rosasco, brilliant future ahead of him, came down to San Bernardino. Something happened. So whatever, horrific, whatever you want to call it, that he lost his mind. He spent the remaining 58 years of his life every day doing mathematical equations, doing astronomical observations, stars in the sky, and doing physical survey on something on the ranch property that remains identified to this day, unidentified.
Okay, that made more sense.
Years.
Well, you said identified, and I was like, was identified? Well, what was it?
Unidentified. I apologize. Yeah. Unidentified. Something that I haven't been able to identify. But something was on the ranch he was doing survey of, mathematical equations, astronomical observations, every day of his life for the 58 years. And he died, in I think 1973 or 74. And Lovecraft fans should recognize something in that. Frank Rosasco's story, remember this happened in late 1915. This predates all of those classic Lovecraft protagonists where the very same thing happens to him. A brilliant guy, usually a scientist or a technician, goes on some trip, goes somewhere, witnesses something that totally unhinges his mind, and then he becomes, the idea of obsession with the stars being right? Mathematical, that has to do with the stars and the positions being right, and then surveying a particular spot, maybe an ancient spot, what was there. That sounds like the Lovecraft protagonist, and I indeed, in Empire of the Wheel 3, lay out the reason why I think Frank Rosasco, that incident, might have been the inspiration for Lovecraft when he created those kinds of characters. In the story in Dagon, in the story of the Horror Red Hook, in Call of Cthulhu, it's repeatedly Lovecraft would have this kind of situation almost identical to the Frank Rosasco situation. And those stories all post-date. They all happen after this happened with Rosasco. And remember, what was going on in San Bernardino was making the newspaper up in San Francisco, in New York, in other parts of the country. This was a mystery that was big, and yet was swept under the rug by the end of December 1915 and never written about or discussed publicly again until Empire of the Wheel, the first book that I co-authored released with my co-author Richard B. Spence. 90-something years later, finally.
Now, did you only have a co-author on the first book?
Yes. Yeah. And how that happened was when I was doing the research phase, Aleister Crowley popped up, and I read the book Secret Agent 666, which is specifically about Aleister Crowley's World War I activity, particularly in the United States in 1915, his tour of the U.S. And I contacted Richard Spence, and he was giving me such great information every time we communicated. He would send me pages and articles and the fantastic background stuff. And finally, I said, Rick, why don't you write this book with me? And he agreed. He lives in Idaho, and he's never been here to San Bernardino. I'm the one that did all the local investigation and stuff, but Rick provided me with just invaluable stuff. And his book on Crowley is very important resource. I was subsequently able to prove that Aleister Crowley had to come through San Bernardino just days before the children were poisoned. And I went to the Railroad Museum here, and they showed me the documentation, and they said that anybody leaving Southern California by train to go east during that particular time, that month, that week that Aleister Crowley was known to have left the San Diego area heading east on a train, they said all passenger traffic was channeled through San Bernardino at that time because of the war, because the rail route down closer to the border, okay, was constantly being raided by Pancho Villa, and the Mexican soldiers and the U.S. would go back and forth. So all passenger traffic, and I was able to, through that research, prove that Aleister Crowley came through San Bernardino during the heart of this dark mystery, which is just a delicious tidbit in all of this. And of course, I think, as I state in the book, that what happened here in San Bernardino in 1915, he knew a lot about. I do not think he had a hand in it. That surprises a lot of people, particularly people who like to bash Crowley. I think it would have appalled him, and I think it definitely was one of the main inspirations for his novel Moonchild. And I go into that in Empire of the Wheel, why I think that. Rick and I go into that, why we think that. And
I think that's one of the few things from Crowley I haven't read. I mean, as far as major books go, I never read Moonchild.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I have a couple of associates that just they sometimes I think they want to pull their hair out over because I say, hey, I've got experience as a criminal investigator, professional investigator here, and I'm telling you, my investigation, I stand by my assertion that Aleister Crowley, they say, oh no, he designed the whole ritual. He came through here to make sure, and they've even gone as far as to say he poisoned the kids. Well, that's impossible because he wasn't even here when they were poisoned. Right. It's just ridiculous. They're anti-Crowley, and that's, because they believe all the apocryphal tales. When you look closely, I think you come away at the conclusion I have that Aleister Crowley would never have had anything to do with what I think went on here in San Bernardino in 1915. He would have very much staunchly opposed it. And
what do you think the end goal was?
Rick and I agreed to call it the San Bernardino working, like a working of magic. And we think this is what was going on in San Bernardino in 1915. The thing we haven't touched on is that all these victims, it has been when you talk about the world grid, like, when you talk about Nikola Tesla and the energy, the world grid of natural energy that flows through the planet, in my opinion, this is the telluric current, which is a very real thing. It's an ELF, an extreme low frequency, that it can be measured. And, engineers, electrical engineers, all these guys, they know about this. They've known about it easily since the 1840s or 50s, and when the railroads were being built. And one of my associates has done a map for me where he uses geomorphology, the reading of the terrain, to identify where the telluric currents would flow. And according to the mapping that he did for me, all 7 of the victims died on this world grid at different points on the world grid. And what this ties into what I think the San Bernardino working was. They were trying to use sympathetic magic. Recently this Pizzagate thing where they're starting to talk about, the sacrificial victims, and they're saying that when victims are murdered, there's this chemical, it's called adreno something. It has to do with adrenaline and stuff like that. That what happens is when you sacrifice a victim in with the knife in the chest, the horrific way, what that does is that spikes this chemical in their blood, right? And theoretically, the people who do that, they're going to get some energy out of drinking the blood. Okay, well, think of that concept, but instead of drinking the blood and that gruesome thing, what they're doing is that they're theoretically, hypothetically, spiking the world grid by aiming that energy, onto one of these world grid spots. That's the theory. Now, here's what Rick and I say in the book multiple times. You, the reader, and we, the writers, we don't have to believe this can work, okay? We don't have to believe that you can kill somebody on it. What we're trying to say is we think whoever the perpetrators were, they believed it.
Yeah.
Okay? They believed it. Just like in ancient times, the ancient Aztecs would sacrifice somebody on a pyramid. It's because they believed that, then the sun god would give them great crops, right? We look at that and go, oh, okay, that's nutty. Well, again, we say to the reader, you, the reader, don't need to accept this or believe it. Neither do we, the writers, say we believe it. What we're trying to say is it looks like somebody believed it. Okay, that was their motive, and what it was to spike the energy, probably to get some immediate gain in the San Bernardino Valley, whether it was an agricultural venture, because when we get into the occult symbolism with Hecate and Persephone and Ceres and all that, there's an agricultural theme tied to that, and this valley was the original home of the navel orange in North America. It was where that was really the cultivation was going on. It wasn't in Florida. A lot of people think it was Florida. No, right here in San Bernardino Valley is where the cultivation of the navel orange was going on. So the citrus industry was huge here. So, it might have been simply that age-old thing, oh, we'll just keep our thing alive. By doing this dark magic. There's also the possibility that by spiking San Bernardino, they might, have been trying to shoot the energy through the entire planet. We go into a thing where if there was something done at the same time that is heretofore undiscovered, or up to this point undiscovered, a similar kind of ritualistic thing going on, maybe they were trying to bring the energy through the recently opened Panama Canal and connect these two energies, East and West Coast. When you're talking about spiritualists, you're talking about the early New Agers, okay? And this is where a lot of these ideas coalesced. When we talk about the New Age today, okay, that's the legacy of the spiritualists, and I mean spiritualists with a capital S, the spiritualist movement, the one that's credited with beginning with the Fox sisters and all that, who later came out and said it was all BS, but that's okay, the faithful want to believe. But the spiritualists were known, to really be dedicated to these ideas. And, in the subsequent decade after the mystery here in San Bernardino, of course, we know that Harry Houdini very famously went after the spiritualists. And I'm one of those who's convinced by the scholarship that's been done on this, that Harry Houdini was actually murdered by spiritualists, corrupt spiritualists.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. There's an excellent book by two authors, Kalish and Sloman. I think it's called The Secret Life of Harry Houdini. It talks about his work for the Secret Service. Now, here's the interesting thing. I'm going to blow your mind. There's a Houdini connection to what happened in San Bernardino in 1915. Okay? Harry Houdini was performing in Los Angeles, by the way, when this stuff was going on here in San Bernardino in 1915. But there's a more direct connection. Okay? This woman, when she was found dead and declared a suicide, okay, in 1915, no church in America would have given, an official funeral, sanctioned church funeral, at least and especially not publicly, for a suicide. It just was not done. Okay, the local, I call them the rector, the minister, the head of the local Episcopal church in San Bernardino in 1915 at that time, on I believe December 7th, gave this woman, this alleged suicide, a very public official church funeral. Okay, now, after he did this, he and his wife packed up their belongings in their house and they left San Bernardino. And they went back to Boston. Now, that reverend's name was the Dr. Walter Franklin Prince. And people who are up on their Houdini history know that Walter Franklin Prince, in late 1915, early 1916, right after he left San Bernardino, went to become the number 2 man at the American Psychical Research Association. And it was in the 1920s, the decade after what happened in San Bernardino, that Walter Franklin Prince and Harry Houdini went after the corrupt spiritualists by exposing them. Now, we have spiritualists here in San Bernardino during this 1915 mystery who I think were implicated in it. I think, it's my opinion, that Prince, he had his first really bad exposure and experience with these spiritualists, with this mystery that went on here with these 7 deaths. And I think that's what fueled his drive to team up with Houdini in subsequent years to go after them. I think what happened here in San Bernardino motivated Prince 10 years later to be part of going after them.
Okay. Let's talk a little more about Etta Place and who she was. She's the one that had the funeral.
Yeah, well,
that you were just talking about.
Yeah, I would. If I hadn't come out with the book, I'd keep it a big secret. But the book's been out there, and I've talked about it. What's interesting is this woman, the central figure in all this mysterious woman who was drowned. She's buried, as I said, under the name Cora Stanton. Rick Spence and I, in the first book, go into why we think that name was a made-up name. The suicide note was fake, and that name has occult significance and such and so forth. In the second book, Empire of the Will, Two Friends from Sonora, I lay out all the details as to who I think Cora Stanton was, and I think she was the woman known as Etta Place. Now, some people are going to say, who was Etta Place? Well, if you're familiar with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you will know who Etta Place was. She was their associate. Okay, she went to South America with Butch and Sundance. Now, the traditional story has always been that Etta Place was a rootin' tootin' saloon gal, who was Sundance's lover or wife. All right. When you look at the actual documented history, there's not as much known about her as the traditional Western historians like to assume and conclude and perpetuate. Okay. What's known about her, the whole thing about her being a saloon gal or a saloon whore or whatever, that was a one-time speculation on the part of a Pinkerton detective who was guessing. Okay. The whole story is much more interesting than the traditional Western story. And it is my position that this woman who's buried under the name Cora Stanton is Etta Place. And it is my theory, my hypothesis, that Etta Place was not Harry Longabaugh's lover or wife. She was not a saloon prostitute. She was a law enforcement operative for the Secret Service. Now, why do we keep coming back to the Secret Service? Okay, at that time, before the 1920s, there was no FBI. Okay, there was one federal agent game in town, and that was the U.S. Secret Service. What a lot of people don't know is, they investigated Treasury offenses, but they also were the only game in town for national security issues. And they were already working national security issues as early as 1900 due to Irish insurgent agents and other things going on. And I lay out in the book why I think Etta Place was actually an operative for the Secret Service, assigned to Butch Cassidy and his hole-in-the-wall gang. She was assigned to them to collect on them and report to the Secret Service. This had to do with Treasury issues, because what were Butch and the gang doing? They were robbing bank cars on trains. They had robbed a few banks. Okay, this had to do with money and currency. It's that simple. So they already had an agent in the gang at the time that Etta joined up, and I'm convinced that agent was none other than Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. Why do I say that? When you look at the history of Harry Longabaugh, it looks suspiciously like kind of a little bit of a made-up adjusted background to cover for a law enforcement operative. He is known to have worked at a particular ranch in Canada that the early, what's called the Northwest Mounted Police then, which became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, okay, they had a station there at this ranch. Okay, I think it was the Bar J Ranch. And I argue that he was American born, but I argue that he was initially recruited into law enforcement by the Northwest Mounted Police to work national security issues because they had trouble with Irish spies, Irish insurgents, possibly trying to get weapons either from Russia or whatever, through Canada. And I argue that that was Longabaugh's introduction into law enforcement. He was working that. Then later, when he came into the United States, the Northwest Mounted Police probably passed him off. He made the introductions to the Secret Service and became recruited by them. Now, you say, Walter, that's nuts. That's crazy. When you look closely at what is actually known about Butch and Sundance, this theory makes perfect sense. Okay? Ed is brought in, and we are told that, I think this was in 1900, Butch Cassidy wanted amnesty. He wanted to stop this life of crime. So he allegedly goes to the governor, I believe, of Utah, Governor Wells, and says, I would like to talk, amnesty with you. And the governor tells him, well, I'm actually legally not the guy who can grant you that. The guy who can grant you that is E.H. Harriman, the chief of the Union Pacific Railroad, because you've been stealing from him. So we're told that overtures were made, but they never met. They never agreed on, he just let it go and decided to continue being a criminal. But here's the interesting thing that happened. After he let it be known that he wanted to request amnesty, from Harriman, the Hole in the Wall gang only robbed one more Union Pacific train. After that, this gang that was the most successful train robbery gang in America at that time, this gang that could do no wrong, always got away, suddenly could do no right. They would get to robberies, there would be a posse there already, okay? They would be chased down. They would get in gunfights. Members of the Hole in the Wall gang were actually getting killed now. But here's the interesting thing. No one ever saw. There's Butch Cassidy and Harry Longabaugh themselves never shot a law enforcement officer. And they increasingly were not present at the robberies where the posses, the law enforcement, were catching the members of their gang. What does that sound like to you? To me, a former federal agent, a law enforcement guy, that right there immediately to me smells like Butch had sold out his gang or was informing on his gang.
Right. Huh.
And through, I argue that now Harry Longabaugh was also known to be a crack shot, expert pistolier. Okay. And yet, in all the times he was with this gang and they're running around doing all the stuff, he never shot and killed anybody. Now, what kind of guy in a criminal gang doing robberies who gets in gunfights but never shoots or kills law enforcement, what kind of guy is that? Well, he's the undercover cop.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. All right. And so Cora was also of undercover.
Yeah, I say she was at a place. And here's the interesting thing. This Cora Stanton woman, when she was pulled out of the water and the medical examiner did an examination of her, he found out she was, in her mid-30s, which Etta would have been about in her early to mid-30s, somewhere in there. And get this woman was discovered to be a virgin. So I asked myself, okay, 35 years old and a virgin, and she was an alleged suicide who the local Episcopal minister gave a very public funeral for, which was a no-no in those days, which suggests that Walter Franklin Prince, the Episcopal minister knew something about this woman that nobody else did. What did he know about her? Did he know her? How could he have known her? Well, it turns out that the Episcopal Church in the United States has a long history with the U.S. intelligence community. Okay? And it so happens that the Episcopal Church has organizations of secular nuns. These are women who are not, sanctioned professional working for the church nuns, but they live the vows and they serve the church in the community. And it just so happens that at the time, at the brothel where she allegedly meets Butch and Sundance for the first time, this is in a region where a particular Episcopal organization that employs secular nuns has a big region, and one of the things they do in this particular organization is provide spiritual and material resource needs for women who worked in the saloons as prostitutes to try to hopefully encourage them to get out of that life, okay? And they would have had members of their Episcopal organization going to visit these girls at the brothels. I argue that was why and how Etta was actually placed in that brothel in the first place. She was placed there as overtly as a member of this organization to help the girls, okay? But she was undercover because, remember, that long history of the Episcopal Church and the U.S. intelligence community. By this time, she was already a Secret Service operative, in my opinion, Treasury Department operative. And they needed somebody to get, another person to get close to the hole in the wall gang. They had Longabaugh, but they needed someone else. And so that, I argue, that's my speculative hypothesis on how Etta came to be involved with the hole in the wall gang and Butch Cassidy and Harry Longabaugh. She was essentially Longabaugh's law enforcement partner, intelligence partner. They weren't lovers because she was a secular nun, in my opinion.
And why do you think she was killed?
That gets into things that were going on with World War. She was killed because, remember, Butch and Sundance disappear by 1908. Okay, we're told that they died. We were told for years that they died in a gunfight down in Bolivia, but that's been questioned for a long time. So they disappear off the scene by 1908. At a place as such, under that name, this woman disappears by 1909. No one knows what happened to her after that. I argue that she was still a Secret Service operative. There were German and other agents working in the United States, particularly in California at the time because of our ports. They were shipping guns through San Diego. And she was a Secret Service operative. I think she was assigned to, come to Southern California to collect intelligence on German agents. So set aside all the mystical speculations and weird stuff. It's very possible that this woman, who I think was at a place, was murdered by a German agent. Okay? That's a possibility. And we discuss that in the book. Rick and I present that in the first book, and I talk about it again in the second book. It's yes, it's possible that there was nothing mystical. If you want to set all that aside, she could have easily have been murdered by German agents because she was going to identify them. Okay, but there's too much of the other mystical stuff, in my opinion, to dismiss all the mystical stuff. And again, it brings it back to Germans because, again, in those, that early part of the 20th century. The German, occult culture was huge, and it was very active even over here in the U.S. So it's like I say, when you look closely, the details are there. Okay, it's not one of those things where, if you look closely, you'll see anything. No. You look closely at the actual details. This stuff that I'm talking about emerges, and it really does make sense. And there's subsequent things, just weird things that happen with record search, archive search, that I've written about in my blog, on my blog, empireofthewheel.blogspot.com. I'm convinced, sitting here tonight, I am convinced that the remains of the woman buried under the name Cora Stanton here at the cemetery here in San Bernardino are actually the historical Oedipus. That woman is Oedipus, in my opinion. The woman we know is Oedipus.
Okay. Let's see. There's a few things I want to try and get through here before we run out of time.
Sure.
Let's talk about, is it the Aron ship that you think he might have been involved with?
Bierce, yeah. What I talk about is, and what it is when I speculate that I think Bierce was somehow involved in this black project, what I think would have been America's first black project, the development of this airship technology right after the end of the Civil War. What I'm trying to do is demonstrate how likely Bierce would have been likely involved with this. So that's the spirit of that. Is I have this gut feeling, this intuition that he might have been involved with it. Here's how I think. So it's very much my speculative hypothesis.
And what was it?
It was simply this. When he was in the Army during the war, he was a survey officer, an engineering type survey officer. Well, that has long been, not just by the United States, but by England and other, intelligence agencies, that has long been a cover for intelligence officers. And when you look at, and we know that Bierce was indeed involved in basic intelligence activities. It's part of his record. So, Bierce was essentially an intelligence officer. Now, what would he do during the war? He would go out on a hill as close to the enemy camp as he could safely get with his survey stuff, and there's pencil and paper and stuff. And really what he was doing was looking at the enemy, looking where their guns were set up, looking, counting heads, that kind of thing, that basic thing. But then by the time he was recruited into the Treasury Department, as an agent, that would have brought him into, a deeper level of this stuff. Now, you recall that I said after the war, he was hired on an expedition, the Hazen expedition, to basically tour the basic trails of connecting all the forts, the Army forts and installations throughout the American West. Okay. Now, when you read the accounts in his own words, Bierce was given a lot of free rein in his duties. What I speculate, what I hypothesize and propose is that this was after the war. This black project to develop this airship technology was in its early stages. And I think the Hazen expedition might very well have been used to identify places out on the prairie, out in the middle of nowhere, that they could use to develop this black project airship technology. Now, there was the issue with the Indian Wars and stuff like that going on. So that, there were likely some locations that were better than others to do this without that kind of interruption. That would have been the kind of thing that Bierce, I think, as a Treasury agent, as an intel guy, would have been out there documenting. I think that was part of why he was really on that expedition, was to help identify potential sites to be used to develop these things, because again, it was out in the middle of nowhere, right? And that's what they needed. Same principle as why we have Area 51 and the new place out in Colorado, whatever. You just want to do this stuff where nobody's going to see you doing it. Right. And again, that's a big fat speculation identified as such in the book, but it shows you what I'm trying to show people is the historical record about Bierce shows and demonstrates that he was in the right places at the right time and under the circumstances, that my speculation is not completely wild and out of nowhere. Okay. My hypothesis is really based on look at the circumstances. People misunderstand circumstantial evidence thanks to television and movies, and that's entirely the fault. thanks to television and movies, there's a bunch of people out there that believe that circumstantial evidence is no good and it's not submissible. There's a lot of criminals guilty as sin, rightfully convicted. Not all. I said there's a lot on circumstantial evidence. Thank God for DNA, because there's some crimes where the guys who've been wrongfully imprisoned are being identified and released, and they should be given $1 million. Thank God for DNA, but for the most part, circumstances matter. And so that's my point with Bierce. Yes, it's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but circumstances in a case like his, because he's not a criminal, circumstances matter. Okay, they can fill in, rightfully and rationally and logically and correctly, certain holes there. But still, ultimately, it's a hypothesis. It's a speculation. You don't even have to listen to it or read it. But that's it's the circumstances are very curious, and they curiously point towards my hypothesis, and maybe others.
And what was that ship, that Arion ship?
The Aron, that comes from Solomon Andrews. Solomon Andrews was a man who, I think it was 1863. He contacted Abraham Lincoln, and he said he had a controlled flight airfoil, airframe, airship that he called the Aron, Aeron. And Lincoln was so intrigued that he told his War Department, Edwin Stanton, who was the secretary at the time, he said, I want your guys to watch, this guy's going to come here and demonstrate this for you. I want you, to check it out and let me know what you think. Well, in the newspapers of the day, there's a report, you can go see it. In fact, Michael Busby, in his book that I mentioned earlier, talks about it. It gives the details that Solomon Andrews demonstrated the controlled flight of this flying thing he called the Aron. And you got to understand, at the time, this was novel, this was new and unique. They had balloons at the time, okay, with not much control, up, down, that kind of thing. But this was a controlled, turn left, right. It could speed it up. It could, gain altitude. It could bring it down. It was an amazing thing to see. But we're told they were so immersed in the war that this was looked at as frivolous and, extraneous, and there's no way they could devote, resources to it. So we are told that Andrews was told thanks, but no thanks. It is my big, fat speculation, due to the circumstances of the 1890s airship mystery 30 years later, it is my big, fat, speculative hypothesis that the War Department did not really tell Andrews goodbye and send him off. I think they procured Andrews's design, and once the war was done and out of the way, I think they, on a classified level, secretly began to tinker around with this and began to develop this technology to the point that 30 years later, in the mid-1890s, we end up with the airship mystery sightings.
Okay. What was the other thing here? And you connect this also to the Nazi Bell technology.
Oh my gosh, yes. Mind-blowing. There's a gentleman who owns a gallery in New York, Stephen Romano, and he has his gallery has put out the best book on Delschau's art. I believe it's called The Art of Delschau. It's a big, thick, hardcover book with beautiful colored plates. It's the book to have for Delschau's art. Stephen Romano had sent me a copy of this book, and I was looking at it, seeing some of these Delschau images for the first time. And these are images that were drawn, paintings and such that were done, again, between 1890 and 1923. Now, the legendary bell was supposedly, experimented with, constructed, and developed by Nazi Germany, okay, in the 1930s, starting maybe in the late 1920s, going into the 1930s and 1940s, okay? It's very much tied to a World War II thing. Now, Delschau died in 1923. In more than one of his drawings prior to 1923, he's showing the device used in the 1850s by the Sonora Aero Club, the 1850s. And those illustrations, in one particular case especially, is identical to the Nazi Bell design that we've heard about. And other designs are like 90% there. It's the same principle. Okay, now what are we told speculatively that the Nazi Bell did? It primarily created or used anti-gravity, right? And what are we told about the Sonora Aero Club by Delschau? That they were messing around with essentially what we would call anti-gravity. And here they had these devices. It's in his drawings. There it is. And I put it in a couple of my books. There it is. Prior to 1923, prior to the Nazis even emerging, there is essentially the Nazi Bell. Okay? And a description of how it works matches the whole thing with the Nazi Bell. There it is in Delschau's writings, which I might add were not public before 1971. These books that were done before the Nazis, done by 1923 when he died, they were in boxes and they were just tucked away somewhere and then thrown out in the trash where they were found in 1971. So it's not like somebody could have, gone to Delschau's books that they saw in some bookstore, right? And then, came up with this Bell thing. There it laid unknown until 1971. And then even then, it was just discovered by the guy that discovered it. He wasn't publishing these things. That didn't emerge until 20-something years later. Okay? And yet there is an example of the Bell, exactly the Bell technology, allegedly being played with in the 1850s. And I made that little discovery, and I'm the first one to put it in a book that, wow, I'm able to connect the Sonora Aero Club to the Nazi Bell by that schematic, those schematics that Delschau did prior to 1923. It's compelling. It is.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I've always gotten the impression that the Nazi Bell was one of those things that no one really knew if they did it or not.
It's still, honestly, it's still in that category, but
Okay.
it's in that category where it's likely that they did something like that, or somebody, messed with something like that. The extent to which it's this whole thing about the Hannibal Nazi flying saucers. I won't even go there with a straight face. That's not. There are people out there that will swear, "Oh no, that's based on legitimate sources." No, it is not. But the most serious Bell researchers, like Igor Wachowski, Joseph Farrell, the others that have written about it, the honest ones, they'll say, look, whatever they were doing with it, it wasn't likely that developed, that advanced. In fact, they will often argue that its advancement, its further development was actually done in the United States through the Operation Paperclip scientists. That actually it was the United States which then took the basic Bell concept and developed it further. But I argue in my books, I say because of this Delschau visual drawing that there it is, there's the Bell, I argue that the thread, because remember, the Sonora Aero Club were Germans who were associated with this German NIMSA group, okay? I show in my books the hypothetical thread based on historical figures and those circumstances that mean something, okay? How the knowledge of this Bell technology, which these guys were using in Sonora in the 1850s, made its way into the hands of the Nazi engineers in the 70 years later. I show that thread, how that could have worked.
Huh. All right. Well, I guess to close this off a little bit, let's talk about Carcosa and what that is. Since that is the name of the book, Destination Carcosa.
Carcosa is many things. It literally was the place that Bierce said his story, an inhabitant of Carcosa, about the man who finds himself in another dimension and then realizes that it's the afterlife. Carcosa again is the literary literal place that Robert W. Chambers says that the mysterious king in yellow has his kingdom in this land, this mythical land of Carcosa. But Carcosa, in my opinion, I say in the book, is really the same thing as the Twilight Zone. Okay, it's just that place, just like Rod Serling says in the show, that dimension between dimensions, and Carcosa represents just this other dimension where things are. It's hard to put your finger on it. You know it when you see it. You know it when you're there, but you don't know how to get there. You're just there. It is mystery itself, is a way to put it. And I say that it also is that Elysian fields, the paradise you go to at the end of your life. And that's why I titled the book Destination Carcosa, because the spirit of Bierce's disappearance when he took off and went and rode his horse across that bridge in El Paso into Mexico and was never, found again or seen again after that. His destination was that mythical Carcosa. To him, to live out his life in South America, that was his Carcosa. So that's where the title of the book comes from.
Do you think that we'll ever really know what happened?
I hope not, unless it's fantastic. And what I mean by that is in the fantastical sense. Unless he steps off an airship still alive, or unless, no, I hope if it's mundane that we don't find out, because it's much more inspirational and, motivating to others that the mystery still lives. And I don't think it's likely, unless his bones turn up and a letter that, he wrote, maybe a journal will turn up that he left when he died that they can confirm through his handwriting. That would be interesting. On the one hand, I say I hope we don't, but on the other hand, I would love to know, no matter how mundane.
One of the things you point out is that this stuff, if it was somehow involved with our government, it is still classified.
Yes. Isn't that interesting? I get into that. We don't have time right now, but it's talked about in the Empire of the Wheel books. It's talked about kind of alluded to in an essay I wrote on empireofthewheel.blogspot.com about the weird experience I had with the archives of the Secret Service and the U.S. National Archives. Here's the thing. If I'm right about Etta Place and she was involved in this stuff, it's over 100 years. It's 103 years, and it would still be classified. And the Bierce disappearance, if he was doing something, exactly, you have to ask yourself, and I ask this in the books, what were they involved in? What was it they saw? What was it they turned up? What was involved in their fates that would require to be classified to this day? And that's the only thing. One of the things I can think of is it has to do with these breakaway civilizations, because they're very, very much still here, very much active in our world. And that's one of the only things I can think of, is that they both encountered these, and it was involved in their fates, and that's why it would remain classified.
Have you ever tried to do a Freedom of Information Act on any of this stuff?
Well, essentially kind of the equivalent of that by going to the National Archives and going to the Secret Service archives. It's, I asked directly. That would be the next step in FOIA, because, if I was lied to, the FOIA would prove that. So No, I haven't tried that specifically yet, but that's a good suggestion.
When's the next book likely to
I
come
was
out?
hoping to come out with this next Secret Missions book by sometime midsummer, but it's because the research is going really well, a little slower than I intended, and because of my recent good fortune with having been doing business with the producer. And I've been working on some other media things, which I'm not ready to announce yet. So with that,
Hmm.
it's kind of slowed down the research process. So I'm hoping to get the next one out maybe October, November.
Cool. All right. And of course, you don't want to talk much about that yet,
Well, about the book,
about the title or
yeah,
anything
it's
like that.
I will tell you that it's very likely going to be a Secret Missions 4, and then the real, the rest of the title. But that's right. I don't know what that is yet. Um,
Okay.
there will be something in there. It'll be my recent. I'll allude to the other books, how it would connect to this new research. Of course. So if you're a fan of these Secret Missions books, you're going to like this one, and you're going to see how it fits with the others. So.
Where's the best place for people to follow you online?
Oh, I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I have the Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. But I want to say this: I'm not the kind of guy that's. I'm not constantly tweeting little research tidbits and stuff. I have days where I'm busy doing other things, and I only tweet a couple of times. And my Facebook has just as much about other projects and personal things that I'm doing. The Walter Bosley channel, I get around to. I'm not doing an alarmist video every other day. I do a video probably sometimes weekly. Usually I try to keep it no longer than every 2 weeks. I'm going to try to get back into weekly. So I honestly, what a lot of people constantly are out there doing on their social media that has to do with their research, I try to save the details of that for the books because I want the books to be something people want to go to and enjoy. So, but you can find me there, Walter Bosley channel at YouTube. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Twitter. I have the empireofthewheel.blogspot.com where I'll do little essays relative to my research. And my books can only be found at lulu.com, Lulu.com, print on demand only. They're worth the wait. They're you got to wait a little longer for it to print and to ship to you, but it's worth the wait because they're very nicely done.
Yes, they are beautifully done. And no ebooks, right?
No, I honestly had to pull my catalog off of Amazon. They're just not very good to small press publishers like myself or indie authors. They're
Mm.
just, it was, had the final bad experience with them and it just wasn't worth it to keep it there. So,
Nothing wrong with physical books.
yeah, they're the best.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us, Walter.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being able to just blab on for so long about me and what I do. This is great. Thank you.
And a special thanks to our Patreons who are pledging $10 or more: William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Supa Inframan, Russell Wilcoxon, Patricia Giaquinta, John Eddy, Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, Donna Beveridge, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. Of course, Patreons already had that part after the first part aired. And if you become a patron, any two-part interviews that I have done all at once, like this one, you get the second or third part, whatever, right away. So you don't have to wait a week. There's also some patron-only type shows, usually AMAs. I do have one that I didn't get a chance to put up yet this week with Timothy and Joshua that goes into a lot of Timothy's personal experiences. And it didn't quite start out that way, but it turned out pretty interesting. So that'll be going up this week for Patreons. And as I said, next week, Rojan will be live in studio. So we'll be doing a live Where Did the Road Go on WVBR. Again, that is May 26th, 2018, and it starts at 10 p.m. Eastern. And you can go to wvbr.com to log in and listen online. And you can go to wheredidtheroadgo.com to shoot us messages while we're doing the show. So it'll always be cool to hear from people while we're doing it live, and then we can kind of just go where it goes. Should be a fun time. So that's next week. I have a couple of other shows, at least one I'm going to be putting up this week on Kundalini. I meant to put it up last week, but things kind of got out of hand last week. So this week, hopefully that'll be coming. And some other fun stuff soon as well, I promise. Here we go. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.